Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you with us this evening for a very special event to launch here in the UK, My Palestine, an Impossible Exile by the late Mohammad Tarbush. And I'll introduce you to Nada in a moment. But just to say a word or two about the current situation. Obviously, in the UK, we now have a new government and a very different parliament. So actually, my colleague Joe, who's head of our parliamentary affairs, and I have been in the Commons a great deal, meeting some of our returning and indeed brand new MPs. So our thoughts, of course, at the moment are very much about the situation in Gaza, indeed the West Bank and the broader region, at a time of atrocities and huge concern about where all of this might lead. So we're working very hard in the few weeks that will be left in this parliamentary session. It'll continue until the end of July to address these issues and hope that we see a rather better, improved, enhanced British government policy. So that's all extremely important, that we're working on that to get funding to UNRWA restored, that the government supports the ICC, the ICJ, that actually takes actions on the arms trade with Israel, amongst many other issues that we believe that should be done. Anyhow, that is the backdrop to this, very painful backdrop, but it's my great pleasure to welcome Nada Tarbush. Nada is indeed the daughter of Mohammad Tarbush, and she, I think, very wisely has continued to bring about the publication of her father's memoirs, which is both a personal story, an extraordinary story. I'm very lucky to have read this now, about his life, in the way that he fled Jericho and his story. He had to leave his family behind in the West Bank, and his journey is very much one that many Palestinians have themselves experienced, but still all the more extraordinary to see it in print, in text, very well expressed. He is somebody, Mohammad Tarbush, who was a key part of the Palestinian national movement at various times. He wrote frequently in newspapers, articles, and various journals. He was also a banker. He was somebody who helped get things done. And I think he had a story that all of you will benefit from reading. It's published by House Publishing, Haus, and I think we've sent you a link where you can obtain a copy. But Nada is going to give us an initial overview and I think some readings from the book, and then we will open it up in the usual way to question and answer from you, the audience. So please do consider any questions and put them into the chat. I will try to get people in as much as possible. Nada, thank you very, very much for being with us this evening and for publishing this. I mean, it cannot be easy for you now to have to talk, you know, about your father's story. So we're very grateful for you to share this. And I think it's so important to remind people of that long story of this conflict, because I think particularly it struck me how often people seem to think this conflict began on the 7th of October 2023, when of course, as we all know, I'm sure on this call, it has, you know, gone on considerably longer, of course. So thank you very much, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Chris and Caabu, for organizing this online briefing, and to everyone in the audience for being here and for your participation. Just a caveat before I begin. I have been working in Palestinian diplomacy for over a decade now, but I'm currently on sabbatical and will be speaking in my personal capacity. I also would like to start by congratulating Caabu for its incredibly important work. For far too long, Arab voices have been lacking in the conversation taking place in the West, including Britain, leading to the persistence of huge misunderstandings or stereotyped images about the Arab region and people. including the Palestinian people. And Caabu has contributed to rectifying this lopsided situation, to bring a measure of balance to the conversation, to shed light on this misunderstood region and give a platform to amplify the voices, stories, and narratives of those who have not been sufficiently heard or whose voices have been deliberately muzzled. And for that, I really thank Caabu. And I know that my father was a great fan of Caabu, and growing up, I heard the word Caabu mentioned many times in conversation, though I wasn't sure what it meant at that point. The desire to dispel misconceptions about the Arab region, the Arab people, the Palestinian people in particular, is one of the main reasons that my father wrote My Palestine. He believed in the power of storytelling to foster understanding and awareness, especially among Western audiences to whom this book is primarily addressed. And this is why in My Palestine, my father intertwines his personal story with the broader history of Palestine and the modern Middle East over the past 100 years. So on every page, it is the story of my father, but it is also the story of the Palestinian people. It is both a memoir and a historical text. So the book reads like a novel with evocative and suspenseful passages, anecdotes, even poems at points, but it is packed with historical narrative and rigorous political and economic and cultural analysis, yet it manages never to be too history heavy or too scholarly. My father describes how he lived the historical events firsthand, his instant reactions to them, and then examines them with the benefit. Oh, apologies. Can you see me again? I think I disappeared. Okay. Right. So, and then he analyzes these events with the detachment and benefit of hindsight needed for more scholarly analysis. I apologize. My husband is being incredibly loud, so just give me a moment while I ask him to. Apologies for that. This is the issue with Zoom when you're at home. Hopefully my cat and dog will not also interrupt us. So as I was saying, my father's writing style is one that brings historical events to life and adds a sense of realism and feelings to the narration. And throughout, as Jan Martel writes, Jan Martel, the author of Life of Pi, my father delineates the catastrophe that has befallen his people, starting with his own family, quote, with righteous indignation, his heart thumping, but a fair mind, his reasoning untainted by hate. Naomi Klein, in her endorsement to the book, wrote that this is far more than a memoir. Mohammad Tarbush's remarkable and courageous life, which he narrates with great lyricism, offers readers a keyhole through which to see the immense forces that created one nation by stealing another. So as a memoir, my father's story depicts a very unusual life, an extraordinary life story of a self-made Palestinian's personal odyssey against all kinds of odds. It conveys universal messages about the power of determination, vision, hard work, perseverance, providential encounters, and modesty to achieve the seemingly impossible. And the unusual course of his life captivated Edward Said, who described him as impressive a man as the Arab world has to show. But perhaps the most powerful message conveyed by his story is the simplest one, that Palestinians are human beings like all others, with dreams to live a normal life, struggles, joys, fears. Such a basic point that is often missed as Palestinians continue to be dehumanized and experience prejudice in the Western media. As a historical text, on the other hand, the book offers a commentary on the events that shaped the history of Palestine since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and these include I won't name them all, but inter alia, Sykes-Picot Agreement, Balfour, 1947 UN Partition Plan, the Nakba, the 1967 war and the Israeli occupation of inter alia, the West Bank and Gaza, the October 1973 war and Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, the 1978 Camp David Accords, the Iran-Iraq war and its impact on Palestine, the 82 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the first Intifada, the first Gulf War, the Oslo process and the peace process in general. Even it goes into the US invasion of Iraq and how that had an impact on Palestine. And finally, the chain of assaults rained down on Gaza since 2007. So one of the people who read the book actually sent me an email recently, which I found quite touching. And he said, quote, "I am so glad to have now read your father's book, as it has enormously increased my knowledge and understanding about the situation in Palestine. I want many more people to read it because here in the UK, which has been responsible for so much of the catastrophe that has unfolded over the years, there remains an ignorance of and indifference to the people of Palestine." So as I said, the recurrent theme of the book is Palestine and its history, displacement, and exile. And reading it really offers helps foster an understanding of these themes. But I would like to say that above all, it is a human story. And the first time I heard the story was as a child, when I knew nothing about Palestine, and I didn't understand all the grown-up talk about exile and refugees. But I was mesmerized by the story that my father recounted to me, often with many cliffhangers. And so his story itself is tragic, dramatic, but it's also, if you read the book, you'll see there's even some amusing moments. It's inspiring. There are moments that feel almost cinematic. And I saw my father as a hero growing up. Abdurrazzaq Gurna, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, in his endorsement of the book wrote that it is an intimate and moving account of the resourcefulness of the human spirit to endure. So growing up, my father's story inspired me in many ways. It had a huge impact on my life choices. Apologies, I think I disappeared again. It had a huge impact on my life choices, my dreams, my perspectives. And so I started nagging my father to write down his story so that other people could equally be inspired. I nagged for many years. And finally, during the COVID lockdowns, I think boredom overtook and he became convinced that he should start to write. The minute he sat down to write, words came flowing out. He couldn't stop. In fact, I was impressed by how quickly he managed to finish the manuscript. It's as if all of those memories came back and he couldn't contain them. So to my satisfaction, by the end of the pandemic, my father had finished the first draft of the manuscript. Yet, tragically, time was not on his side and his heart weakened, led him to pass away in January 2022, before the editing of the manuscript was complete. So the sense of loss and grief that I felt at the passing of my father was immeasurable. And my only consolation was that I held in my hands this manuscript, which he cherished and on which he had worked during the last years and days of his life. So in trying to dampen the feeling of his absence, I felt a certain solace in dedicating my time to getting this book published. And I was pleased when House Publishing expressed a desire to take over where my father left off and publish the book. I don't want to give spoilers or too many details about the story, but let me elaborate a little bit about my father's life. And after I do that, I will speak a little bit about the current situation in Palestine and how the book is relevant to that. So my father was born in the Palestinian village of Beit Natif, which is a small farming village some 20 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. He was born in 1948 during the British mandate of Palestine. During the Nakba, he and his family were forced to evacuate their village together with its entire population after the Zionist victory that led to the establishment of the State of Israel. They became landless refugees in Jericho and sank into poverty. They lost everything that they owned. So years later, my father grew up in Jericho, and when he finally graduated high school, he contemplated what to do with his life, given that employment and prospects for a reasonable life were bleak. At the age of 16, with broken English, learned at an UNRWA refugee school, a handful of dollars, and a small duffel bag containing a single change of clothes, he decided to walk out of Jericho without telling his parents and threw himself into the unknown, determined to make a different life for himself, his family, and his people. So his plan was actually to hitchhike from Jericho to Switzerland, inspired by a Swiss postcard featuring the Alps. His journey from Palestine to Europe was filled with bumpy roads and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Yet he kept on, and a mixture of determination and providential encounters made that seemingly impossible journey possible. The key was adaptation and grit. And here I would like to read one passage from my father's book, which I feel demonstrates that kind of attitude that he had. So if you'll bear with me, this is the point in his journey where he's in Yugoslavia, and he's trying to reach Switzerland. So he's at the border with Austria. And this is what happens. Since it never rained during springtime in Jericho, I was surprised when one April evening on the outskirts of Sarajevo, there was a sudden thunderstorm, and my soaked-through clothes clung to me like plaster. I walked to the nearest town, my head lowered against the curtains of rain, and spent the night soaked and shivering on the doorstep of a shop, trying to shelter while water poured all around, forming little waterfalls down the steps. The next day it continued to rain, and no one was tempted to pick up a bedraggled young stranger. I spent that night in a tall haystack, digging myself a shallow burrow. The haystack creaked and swayed all night, and I thought it might well come crashing down on me, but I was too exhausted to care. From there, it took me 4 days to reach Zagreb, and another day before I got a lift with an Austrian driver and decided to go with him to Austria. As we approached the border and the land became higher and alpine with wooden chalets, I grew quite excited. Switzerland would be like this too. At the border, an Austrian officer came forward to check cars and papers. He took my passport and quickly returned it to the driver. "No visa," he said to me in English. Until that point, I'd had no difficulty worth mentioning in being allowed into the countries I traveled through. Perhaps Jordan was on good terms with those countries. Just a parenthesis. For those who don't know, at that time, the West Bank was under the control of Jordan, which is why Palestinians in the West Bank had Jordanian papers. So, end of parenthesis. Perhaps Jordan was on good terms with those countries, or I looked inoffensive enough to be their border officials. It also helped that travelers by road in those days were far and few between. The driver explained to the officer that I was transiting through Austria on my way to study in Switzerland. The officer took the passport again, leafed through it, and threw it back at me, saying, "No Swiss visa, get out of the car," then asked the driver to move on. I waited for him to examine another car that was behind us. After he had finished, I started to walk towards him when he yelled at me in a language I did not know. "Weg, weg," he repeated loudly, pointing his finger in the direction of Yugoslavia. Later, I learned that he was saying "Weg, weg," German for "get away from here, off with you." It was frustrating to see Austria so close, just past the guards in their uniforms, but it was no good loitering. Dejected, I turned back. The officer's command was carved in my memory. In silence, I kept repeating it as I waited on the opposite side of the road, hitching a lift back to Yugoslavia. I consoled myself with the thought that the idea of Italy somehow appealed to me, that leg of land sticking randomly down far into the Mediterranean, so out of place. I hitchhiked to Ljubljana, where I spent the night, and continued the following morning to Trieste, the Italian city on the border with Yugoslavia, encountering no difficulty whatsoever in gaining entry to Italy. Barely a year previously, the Pope had visited the holy places of Jerusalem, which was then under the sovereignty of Jordan, and was met with much publicized euphoria and acclamation. The local press was filled with stories not only about the deep-rooted affinity between the Catholic Church and Jerusalem, but also the legacies left after 7 centuries of Roman rule over Palestine. Maybe the goodwill created by that visit was the reason for the warm way I was treated by the Italian frontier guards. Deciding I would take the next lift wherever it went in Italy, I got picked up by a truck going to Florence, which the 2 drivers showed me on the map. I jumped up into the cab, and while I sat perched high up in front with a sweeping view all around, they insisted on giving me apples and pears while they sang Italian songs, and being altogether very cheerful, oblivious of my terror as the truck hurtled through northern Italy at breathtaking speed. It was springtime, and everything seemed in full bloom. We passed green fields painted with wildflowers, vines, and numerous crumbling balconied villas with faded facades and closed shutters. It was a long way to Florence, and it was nighttime when we arrived, one of the drivers already snoring thunderously. They tooted loudly as they left me near a bridge studded with lights. The river Arno shimmered, and the bright streets were thronging. A man was selling watermelon, and I could not resist buying a piece and munching it as I walked through the crowds. I enjoyed that feeling of complete anonymity and did not feel lonely. But as a solitary traveler for about 5 weeks, I was beginning to feel homesick. I thought a lot about home. Palestine was the framework within which my life was organized, what pushed my determination somehow to make a success of this adventure and equip myself to be able to help back home. This drive had now become the essence of my identity. So that's the end of the passage about him crossing from Yugoslavia into Italy. And so my father, once he reached Italy, adapted once again, found manual labor, and managed to get enough cash every time to be able to continue the journey. And after about 1 year of rough travel and stints of manual labor in Italy and Switzerland, which he eventually reached, he decided to pursue his education in England, where he enrolled for A-levels and found imaginative ways of financing his studies. Throughout this time, he lived in a variety of places, from parks in the open air to sleeping wagons and a boiler house, and worked in a range of jobs from cleaner to stagehand to strawberry picker and factory worker. And when his meager salaries from part-time jobs became insufficient, his willpower and deeply ingrained attitude that nothing was impossible filled him with the confidence to approach royals and persuade them to cover the chronic shortages by sponsoring his education and thrusting him through the bumpy roads leading to the universities of Durham, London, and then Oxford, where he completed his studies with a DPhil. But despite my father's personal success, his attachment to his homeland was too strong, his childhood experiences too fresh, developments in Palestine too brutal, and his identity as a Palestinian too endangered to ever forget the plight of the Palestinian people. His exile was impossible, and this is the subtitle of a book, An Impossible Exile, in the sense that he could never leave Palestine behind. His ambition to alleviate the injustice faced by a defeated, deprived, powerless Palestine only grew stronger, and he used every opportunity he had to start a conversation with the Western public and explain the justice of the Palestinian people's cause, using the most prestigious platforms to deliver his message, from the Times, the Guardian, the International Herald Tribune, Le Monde, the Los Angeles Times, the Observer, and others. And reluctantly, but determined to be pragmatic and lift his family out of poverty, he decided to embark on a high-level career in banking in Paris and Geneva. This career allowed him to rub shoulders with important figures in the worlds of global economics, politics, and international affairs. And he decided from this position in the world of finance to capitalize on the wide network of friends, contacts, and connections that he soon built up among politicians and the media to further promote the Palestinian cause in the world of diplomacy and international affairs. Until his death, Palestine was my father's beacon of light. It defined and guided every aspect of his life, what he thought about, what he wrote about, what he ate, what he grew in his garden, what he loved most. It is sufficient to go and visit his garden in the countryside, filled with olive trees, pomegranate trees, fig trees, or look at his breakfast table every morning, always scattered with sage, olive oil, za'atar, thyme, and other Palestinian staples to understand the extent to which Palestine lived on inside him. And such behavior is not unique to my father. A friend told me that her father did the exact same. It captures the pain of displacement, that feeling of being uprooted, and the struggle to preserve Palestinian identity, what it means to be a Palestinian in exile, and the enduring intimate connection to a threatened homeland. So his book, My Palestine, is his final act of advocacy for his homeland and the Palestinian people. And given now, talking about the current situation, given the events of and since the 7th of October in Israel, Palestine, this book is more relevant than ever, and perhaps it is down to fate's wisdom that it ended up being published only now, 2 years after it was originally written. Its relevance, firstly, is because these tragic developments cannot be isolated from their historical and political context. They are the culmination of more than 7 decades of history, which are duly analyzed in My Palestine. It is impossible for anyone, be they students, journalists, diplomats, parliamentarians, or the general public, to understand and in turn to try to think of sustainable solutions to the ongoing crisis without having an understanding first of the history of Israel, Palestine, and the region more broadly. But I would also argue that a historical and political understanding on its own is insufficient. I would argue that it is impossible to fully grasp the events of the past 9 months without also ridding oneself of stereotyped and dehumanizing images of Palestinians that are rampant in the Western media, of ridding oneself of a media environment where the Palestinian side of the story is often silenced, muted, and drowned out. Indeed, it is this type of dehumanization which has enabled the decades-long commission of ethnic cleansing campaigns, now culminating in genocide, against the Palestinian people. And that is why combining historical knowledge with hearing Palestinian stories and hearing directly from Palestinians about their lived experiences is vital. And this is why I believe the book, in that respect, could also not be timelier. And to get to the end of my presentation, looking at the future, these elements, history and hearing Palestinian lived experiences, demonstrate that the status quo is untenable and that it is high time, for the sake of peace between Palestinians and Israelis, for action to be taken, not only to end the current tragedy, but also to finally address and resolve the root causes of recurrent crises and suffering, to eliminate the conditions that sustain this violence, namely ending 76 years of Palestinian dispossession and subjugation, 57 years of military occupation of Palestinian land, which is the longest belligerent military occupation in modern history, ending 17 years of illegal blockading of Gaza and chronic impunity for violations of international law. And that is the conclusion that my father draws. These are the conditions that need to be eliminated to usher in a new chapter of peace, stability, and security in the Holy Land and more broadly in the Middle East. As Arundhati Roy, who also wrote an endorsement for the book, said, "It is impossible to read this book and continue to argue for the status quo." But the question on everyone's mind is, how realistic is it that this would happen, that occupation will be ended, blockade, the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing violent dispossession and ethnic cleansing? So here, let me remind that on Thursday, in 2 days' time, the International Court of Justice will publish its long-awaited advisory opinion on the legal status of Israel's occupation of Palestinian land and decades-long denial of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. And over the coming years, this same court will be issuing its ruling in the case of South Africa versus Israel, in which Israel stands accused of committing the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people. So the next few days, months, and years will be instrumental in shaping the future of Palestine and Israel. And while it is very difficult to be optimistic these days, seeing the daily massacres and atrocities that are being committed and the inaction of the international community in that regard, I must end on an optimistic note. My father's attitude was do not despair, and he harbored a relentless, stubborn hope. And in his spirit, let me say this: despite generations of frustration and defeat, for the very first time, there is a strong sentiment among people worldwide who have been advocating for the implementation of international law and justice for the Palestinians that we are reaching a tipping point. We are reaching a South Africa point in Palestine's history. As Israel stands accused of genocide at the ICJ, of the crime of apartheid by all major human rights organizations worldwide, as its extremist leaders continue colonization activities, including settlement construction, and moves to annex Palestinian territory in the West Bank, and openly express the rejection of Palestinian self-determination, and officially announce, as Eli Cohen, then Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, did, in response to the recognitions of the state of Palestine by Norway, Ireland, and Spain. He said, "From the river to the sea, there will be one state, the state of Israel." As people see the images of total disrespect for basic rules of legality and morality coming out of Gaza, governments cannot forever continue to hide behind false rhetoric, and sooner or later, to secure their own interests, they will need to disassociate themselves from the regressive policies and practices of what is fast becoming viewed as a pariah state, and finally take concrete action to effect policy change and help usher in a story that for far too long, a story of peace in a context that for far too long has been marked by conflict and tragedy. And so if I may, I'll try to be very quick. If I may end by reading one last passage from my father's book. This is where he talks about the future. He says, "The status quo is untenable. The die has been cast, and that the day will come when the Palestinians' call for freedom will finally be answered is inevitable. That will also be the day of liberation for Israeli society from its doomed apartheid system, and Israel's overwhelming military will not be able to fight the turning tide of global public opinion and moral outcry. Sophisticated armament and a nuclear capability did not prevent the apartheid regime in South Africa from tumbling like a house of cards. They were useless in the face of surging moral arguments embraced and fostered in the UK and the US, South Africa's staunchest allies, whose governments had the good, albeit long overdue sense, to yield to the mounting demands of global public opinion, and the courage to make the call for economic sacrifices and finally abandon Pretoria's apartheid regime. Even on a realpolitik level, Israel's Western allies will soon find that it is no longer in their national interest to continue to politically, financially, and militarily support a state that is so far removed from their professed values of freedom and democracy. Allowing Israel a free hand to continue its annexationist and apartheid policies would bring further accusations of double standards against the West and risk further discrediting the international system as a whole, especially in the Middle East, where faith in international law and the UN has plummeted, which would only create more extremism and instability, both of which are in the interests of no one. What the United States and other friends of Israel will also realize is that the appeasement of Israel will not help Israel, but instead only increase its international isolation and inevitable self-sabotage. As friends, they should instead apply the pressure needed for Israel to reassess its policies and grasp the damage it is doing to the long-term interests of its own people, citizens of what is being increasingly recognized as an apartheid state. They should incentivize Israel to end its oppressive measures and usher in the peaceful coexistence that with the Palestinian people that it objectively needs. As the Palestinian people have clearly demonstrated over the past 7 decades, they are here to stay, and no amount of subjugation will lead them to surrender or conveniently disappear. Israel's successive wars have gained it more territory, but failed to break the Palestinians' will to be free. So to Israel and its allies, I say that it is no use putting your heads in the sand. The status quo is unsustainable, and the vicious cycle, expansion, ethnic cleansing, subjugation, will eventually be broken. The question is whether the world will wait for that to happen gradually, with all of the additional human suffering that would entail, or whether the political will can be mobilized to bring about a solution now. And so on this note, I would like to end my presentation of my father's book, and I look forward to any questions you might have. And thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much, Nada. I think that was absolutely terrific. And it's just to remind you, this is what it's all about. Mohammad Tarbush's great book, My Palestine, An Impossible Exile. And from reading it, I would say that actually that story, that first bit of that exile, where he decides to leave as a teenager, I think he was, from Jericho through Europe, was really quite extraordinary. You know, and one thinks today of people who make similar journeys, but they've got Google Maps and Facebook and all sorts of other modes of communication and transport that weren't available in those days. Hitchhiking through Syria, which I've actually done, it would never have been particularly easy as well. So, an extraordinary account. I've asked people if you could put any questions that you may have for Nada in the chat. I just wanted to kick off myself. What do you think your father would have made of the situation that has unfurled in Gaza in the last 9-10 months? I mean, what would he have been saying, do you think?
Thank you very much, Chris. And that is a question I think about very often. Knowing my father, he would have been absolutely heartbroken. And in many ways, I thank the heavens that he is not witnessing what we are witnessing. And at the same time, knowing my father's attitude in life and his stubborn hope, his stubborn feeling that things will work out in the end, I know that he would have had a glimmer of optimism. And so, you know, I feel that to start with my initial point of his heartbreak, I think it would have come from seeing that the Nakba, the original Nakba in 1948, is now tenfold what, you know, in terms of the number, the scale of things, the scale of the ethnic cleansing happening. And I don't think anyone would have expected this to happen again at such a level, with the complicity of so many countries, with the inaction, with the Western countries, many of them who have influence on Israel, refusing to lift a finger. This would not have surprised him, but it would have broken him. Because you'd sometimes wonder what has to happen in order for states to take action. If apartheid is not enough, genocide is not enough, torture in prisons is not enough. If it feels, and my father mentions this in the book, it's as if Palestinians are screaming to be heard but making no sound. And this feeling is really devastating, I think, as Palestinians worldwide, but also as people of conscience worldwide, people who believe in international law, in morality, in justice. And so what he would have liked is not only for the Palestinians to be heard, but for the Palestinian call to be answered, because it is really unconscionable that after so many years of pleading with the international community, the Palestinian call is not only unanswered, but often there is a lot of gaslighting happening, making us feel that we don't have the right to make these calls. And on the more positive note, I think that my father would have seen, for example, the student movements that are taking place, the fact that young people worldwide have embraced Palestine as the cause of their generation, the fact that probably awareness of the Palestinian cause has reached a new high. People are more interested to learn, are reading about it more, are listening more to Palestinian voices, albeit not in the mainstream media where these voices are still very much lacking, but at least on social media or in events like those of today. And so there is that glimmer of hope that things are unsustainable and can only get better, because we can't imagine after genocide, after all the crimes, the most egregious crimes have been committed, what more can happen? There has to be a turning point. And so I think he would have had these mixed feelings.
Thank you. You mentioned international law. I did post the announcement from the ICJ about their ruling coming out on Friday in the chat. And I totally agree with the embarrassment, the shame of the position of the international major powers. I've got a question from Roger Higginson. Roger, do you want to ask your question?
Hello, thank you, Chris. Nada, thank you for a really fascinating talk. I very much enjoyed it. It reminded me of a book that I read when I was preparing my PhD thesis on the British Mandate in Palestine. And I'm sure you'll know it. It's Raja Shehade's Rift in Time, Travels with My Ottoman Uncle. I would be very interested to know, what's your perspective on the extent to which your father's experiences in Europe must have broadened and deepened in some ways his understanding of the situation in Palestine, which maybe those who traveled around the Palestine area and were staying within the Arab world, they didn't have the advantage of that broader perspective. Because this seems to me the rather unique characteristic of what your father has done. And forgive me, I haven't yet read the book, but for a Palestinian to come out of Palestine and make a successful, apparently, banking career in Europe, well, that's really quite something. So he must have had a slightly different take on things, I guess, but I would very much appreciate your views. Thank you.
Nada.
Thank you. Thank you. That is definitely, I think, one of the aspects that made my father's voice so nuanced, in a sense. So when you read the book, you'll see that he had one foot in each place. Palestine always inhabited him, but he was very well aware and very well integrated in European society. He also followed very meticulously the kind of analysis and rhetoric about Palestine that was being spread in Western media. So he knew the kind of arguments, the kind of background that led to that led certain states to take certain positions that, you know, if you haven't necessarily understood that kind of historical background in Europe as well, it's difficult to understand why would states be so indifferent or indifferent, especially when many of them are the reason that the catastrophe in Palestine has taken place. And I'm talking here mainly about Britain, Germany, and the United States and so on. And so it definitely gave him that ability to put himself in the shoes of Europeans who sometimes, as a result of a feeling of guilt, especially in Germany, about the Holocaust, for example, could not really look at Palestine in an objective way because their vision or their thoughts were limited by the fact that they felt that the crimes they committed against the Jews would mean that they have to overlook what is happening to the Palestinians. And of course, my father, very much aware of that, wrote many articles. In fact, quite a lot of the book is about that. And he talks about how he felt that it was difficult for him to draw the attention of people to the Palestinian plight because of this, because of the fact that in Europe there was this history, which meant that that Palestinians couldn't be seen in a very objective light. And so I think this is what makes, in some ways, my father's book unique, which is that he has this double consciousness, this consciousness both of what it means to be a Palestinian, what it feels like, but also what it feels like to be a European with that history. And he's able to navigate the two and try to think of very he was an objective man, a man with a lot of self-introspection and criticism, and a scholar. I mean, he did his PhD at Oxford in history. And so he could really detach himself and try to think about the forces that led to one thing or another. And I think that gives him the ability to think of creative solutions.
Thank you.
Great. I've got a question from Francis Sinclair. Francis, are you with us?
Yes, just had to unmute. Yes, given the amount of the political establishment at Westminster that have been receiving funding from Friends of Israel, how can we have any hope of real change when they receive so much money?
I'm very sorry, my connection cut a little bit. The question was about the US political establishment or the UK?
The UK.
Westminster, UK.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something my father talks about in the book, which is the role of lobbies. The pro-Israel lobby, whether it's in the United States or in the United Kingdom and so on, of course, has an undeniable role in influencing politicians. And this, the solution to that is the power of the electorate, really. I think to make it clear that we also want politicians who can overlook these kind of influences and think more objectively in terms purely of international law and justice and morality. And so there is the power of the people in that regard that can counter this influence, but also there has to be, and I think this is something that my father tried to work on, there has to be also advocacy from the Palestinian side and more generally from the Arab world. The voices of Palestinians have been lacking. And I think this is also, to be fair, it's not only because of censorship of Palestinian and Arab voices. It's also because Palestinians and Arabs have not had a very long history in Europe. So they, I mean, they're still trying to get their discourse across, their narrative, their messages across, but they are not, there is, for example, the Zionist narrative has been present in Europe for much longer. Advocacy for the Zionist ideology has been in Europe. Palestinian voices are relatively new in that regard when you compare. And so I think there has to be more of an effort on that front. And that's the way I think that politics can be influenced, is by spreading objective narratives that use objective criteria like international law as a benchmark, and that no one can, at the end of the day, disagree with. We're not calling for people to be pro-Palestinian. We're calling for them to be pro the laws that they themselves have committed to. And so this is where I think there's a lot of change in narrative to be done. we need to explain that this is not about being biased to one or another. It's simply about being fair. We're not asking for special treatment as Palestinians. We simply don't want Israel to be treated with exceptionalism and special treatment as a country above the law. So I think these kind of messages have to be reinforced in order to counter that kind of undue influence, which tries to get politicians to act in accordance with interests, including financial interests, rather than objective criteria.
Thank you for that. And I would also, obviously, working in Westminster a great deal, endorse that. It's up to us to put the case across as well in a vigorous, fashion. And I hope you're writing to your MPs, whether they're new or re-elected. I would just say, and just to make a little announcement for those who have not seen, because I don't think it's been widely reported, that one of Caabu's patrons, the ex-Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan, did a press conference today. I'll post the findings in the chat, in which he announced that he'd been completely cleared by the internal Conservative Party investigation into any allegations of anti-Semitism, further to charges that were widely made against him back in April. So, yet again, this is something I think that we always have to be, careful of, but also to stand up against these charges when they are false. Now, we also have a question from Hookie Walker. Hookie, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here. I'm afraid it's a very practical question. I thought that Tarbush's talk was absolutely superb. I'll certainly buy the book, which I've not yet read. I'm a deep pessimist, basically because we have a right-wing Israel government that nothing seems able to stop. We have a the only country that can influence Israel is the United States, and the Congress seems to be under the control of the Israel lobby. So I'm a pessimist, but we must keep trying. And thinking ahead to the practicalities, I just wondered what Mrs. Tarbush herself thought might be a practical and reasonable solution to the problem of Palestinian refugees, given that now Israel has something like 700,000 settlers occupying Palestinian land.
Thank you so much for that question. And of course, this question is one that I hold close to my heart, because my father was a Palestinian refugee, and he actually speaks about this in the book. He talks about the solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. I mean, the way he imagines it, my father believed that the two-state solution, unfortunately, had reached a dead end and that it was no longer practically possible to implement it. So he advocates for a one-state solution. And the way he imagines the Palestinian refugees' right of return to be implemented is that the villages, actually, he quotes a statistic, which is that the vast majority of villages from which Palestinian refugees originate, the 1948 villages, are still empty, mainly empty land. I mean, there was a study done by Salman Abu Sitta about this, and the depopulated villages, many of them are sort of green spaces and so on. And so he suggests that in exchange for settlements staying in their place but becoming desegregated, in other words, anyone can live in them, he imagines a democratic state for all its citizens, Palestinian refugees would be able to resettle back in their villages of origin, where again, there have been studies that say that this demographically and practically in terms of land space should be possible. And to imagine in that regard, a coexistence where everyone's rights are fulfilled and there is thus a justice. Now, of course, people will say, that you have millions of refugees and there is no space for them and so on. He tries to argue that there is space, but even if there wasn't, or even if Palestinian refugees, some of them, were not willing to go back for any reason, there is compensation that has to be paid. I mean, this is international law. There has to be the rights of the refugees have to be recognized and compensated for if they choose not to implement them. So in that regard, many will view this as a bit of an idealistic solution. I think that it's one that has been insufficiently explored. Under the two-state model, the rights of refugees would be significantly curtailed. But there are some practical options that I believe have simply not been studied enough because there's a lack of desire to do so, because Israel has rejected both the two-state solution and the one-state solution. In fact, it has chosen simply genocide as a solution just to get rid of the population. But more research can be done into this, and that's what I think my father would have answered to your question.
Okay, well, we've got a couple of questions left in the chat, so I'm just going to very quickly summarize them. One from Juliana Fahar is asking, why will the ICJ verdict, whatever it may turn out to be on Friday, be any different from the previous verdicts, whether it was on the wall or genocide in Gaza? But also from Gillian Dare, who's asking about the sort of reception your father actually received, the sympathy, the friendliness from ordinary people along that journey that he made all those years ago. What was that like? And also one from Samar Betmouni, who is asking whether you think that part of the problem about this conflict and resolving it is that in the West we see it too often as a religion-based problem rather than a human rights issue.
These are all excellent questions, and I am aware of the time, so I'm going to try to answer as quickly as I can. On the first one, on the advisory opinion, there is a lot of skepticism, and I think this skepticism is legitimate because there has been an advisory opinion in the past on the wall saying that the wall is illegal, and this advisory opinion was not implemented in the sense that the wall still exists and has become bigger and longer. However, I think that what makes this advisory opinion different is that we're the way I see it is that the Palestinian cause has been fragmented in many ways. We talk about the wall being illegal, the settlements being illegal, torture and arbitrary detention being illegal. But we need to look at the whole system, which is creating these illegalities. And the whole system is a system of occupation, subjugation, and apartheid. And so this advisory opinion is finally asking the court to look into the system as a whole, whether the occupation has reached the point of colonialism, whether the apartheid nature of the segregation taking place in the West Bank and so on makes this occupation illegal. And so in that sense, I think that should the court be objective, and I mean, we're talking about the longest military occupation in modern history, should it say that it's illegal, which is our hope, then this will have consequences for third parties, for third states. If the occupation is determined to be illegal, then there cannot be a business as usual relationship with it. And it is our hope that states will be responsible and fulfill their obligations. Of course, there is skepticism since they haven't fulfilled their obligations in many other ways, including now the UK continuing to transfer arms during genocide, continuing to trade with settlements despite calling for a two-state solution and so on. There is a lot of hypocrisy, but it will at least give a tool, a very powerful tool, to be able to advocate more strongly for an end to the occupation and for states to take the responsibility seriously. On the second question about the kindness of strangers, I mean, this is one of the aspects of my father's story that has had a profound impact on me. When hopefully you read the story in more detail, you will see that his life was his success in the hitchhike, in terms of going to university, getting funding for university and so on. came from the kindness of strangers and from providential encounters. And I think this really shaped his perspective, not only on people, but on the humanity of people and the fundamental goodness of people. And this idea that peace can always prevail and people can always look beyond their self-interests and be generous in that sense, and empathetic to others. And finally, the third question of Israel-Palestine being seen through a religious lens, I think this is one of the absolute problems and misconceptions that there are, because this has nothing to do with religion. It has never been about religion. Had the occupiers of Palestine, of Palestinian land, been of any religion, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, it doesn't matter, atheist, the Palestinian people would have resisted that, would have resisted the rights being subjugated and violated, and spoken about that just as much. And in fact, my father makes the point that Palestine, historic Palestine, was always multi-religious, multicultural, and that coexistence existed between the faiths, and that Jews have always been welcome in Palestine, have always been a part of the Palestinian mosaic. This has nothing to do with, unfortunately, the very European phenomenon of anti-Semitism is one which is being used to try and accuse Palestinians of it and silence their voices and make it seem like they're bigoted. But this is absolutely untrue. And one of the main myths, I think, surrounding this conflict, which is that criticism of Israel is equivalent to criticism of Judaism. And in fact, my father argues that Judaism is a beautiful religion with very noble ethics, and that it is really horrendous to equate it with a movement based on colonialism and subjugation of others, because that has nothing to do with Jewish ethics. So, so I think absolutely you're right. This is one of the main reasons why Palestinians are so misunderstood in the West, because of this rhetoric that Judaism and Zionism are somehow one.
Well, I'm afraid we've now run out of time, but I think that was an absolutely wonderful presentation. It is, I should stress again, a wonderful book. Please go out. I know a number of you have said so, but buy the book. Get it, give it to a friend, give it to a relative. It's certainly worthwhile and beautifully written as well. And also, you know, as we have only a couple of weeks left in this month, those of you who hadn't written to your new MPs, just to remind you, please do so. There is so much to get them working on right now, because obviously the situation, you know, in Palestine at the moment is so unfortunately dire. But I'd just like to, for all of you, just to thank you for attending tonight, and in particular to Nada for speaking so eloquently about her father's memoir. We very much look forward to seeing you all at future events, and hopefully in happier, less troubled times. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.